Hello, I am Steve Hill, Marketing Director for SCADA Software and Solutions at Emerson Remote Automation Solutions. In this video, I will show you how to add an Emerson FB3000 RTU to an AUTOSOL ACM system and how to configure it to generate FLOWCAL CFX files. The configuration will be done in such a way that it makes it easy to clone the initial RTU to create and add additional RTUs on the system using a very similar configuration. We'll show that cloning in a separate video. So let's get started. Before we look at the AUTOSOL ACM system, let's take a quick look at the RTU configuration using Emerson Field Tools and FBX Connect. We connect to the RTU, and then we'll take a look at the configurations of the meters and the historical within the RTU. Once you've connected to the device, FBX Connect will launch. So we click on Monitor, then select Gas, and choose DP meter. This is the first meter we have configured in the RTU. And on this screen, we will see the real-time data from the RTU, together with data from the previous hour, the current hour, previous day, current day. So this screen gives a quick overview of the meter, and we can see that we do have gas flowing. This is actually simulated for the video, but the meter is active and measuring. And we can then take a look at the historical configuration for this meter by clicking on Monitor, History. The Station 1 history by default is in Historical Group 4, and if we bring that historical group up, we can see data being logged hourly, and we can see differential, pressure, a total and average, and various other parameters, all of which will be used by ACM to generate the CFX file. Later we will see the same data in the AUTOSOL CFX file. But for now, we will close FBX Connect and also close or minimize Field Tools. The first step in adding an FB3000 to your ACM system is to open the ACM configuration tool. Here you'll see that we have a completely empty AUTOSOL ACM configuration. The first thing we're going to do is to import some templates for the FB3000 that were created by AUTOSOL. These you will find in a text file, which you can obtain from AUTOSOL. These are not strictly necessary to add an RTU to the system. Much of the configuration information they contain is now automatically added to the system when it first communicates to the RTU, but it's useful to have these for a later video where we'll show how to map event maps and alarm maps if these are different configurations for your different devices. For the moment, we're not going to use these, but I would recommend adding them to your system. Each RTU will require a schedule. If this is the first RTU you've added to the system, there will not be any schedules, so you need to add them. First, create a folder to hold those schedules, and I'm going to call my folder Schedules. Then right-click on that folder and click Add, and then choose Schedule from the right-click menu. Right-click, Edit, and use the form to edit that. You then need to click on the Details tab, and you can change the name. You can use any name you want here. I'm just going to use Main Schedule. And then click on the Schedule tab and configure it. Each schedule contains many subschedules called intervals. You need to have at least one, which is fairly quick. I'm going to call that Real Time, and configure that to trigger every 10 seconds. The default is 2. So I've increased that to 10 seconds. And then I'm going to add a second schedule at interval 15. It's arbitrary which interval to use. And I'll make this my hourly schedule for collecting historical data, alarms, and events. So I call it hourly. You can choose any name. And change the period to be hourly. Note that I reduce the seconds to 0. Save that. But then you'll notice that there's still a red symbol saying this is disabled. So you need to go to the General tab and click Enabled. So close that. After creating the schedule, you need to create a communications port. Again, create a folder. And in this case, I'm going to name my folders ports. The names of these folders don't matter, but it's useful to organize the components you're creating. Right-click on the folder, add port, and choose a TCP IP port. That's because my RTU is connected via Ethernet. Then right-click, edit using the form, and here you can change the properties of that port. I normally change the name of the port to describe what its function is, and here I'm going to include in the name the IP address and also indicate I'm communicating via DNP3. Again, the name has nothing to do with the functionality, it's just description. But here we choose options. By default, you may not need to change any of these. It depends on the type of link you've got. But then click on port. And here, because it's a TCP IP port, we need to specify the host address, which for my RTU is 192.168.1.151. And then very importantly, the port used for communications on the RTU. For DNP3, that is 20,000. You then need to enable the port and save it. And you'll see the symbol on the left changes. After adding the schedule and the port we're going to use, we can now start adding devices. I recommend that each device is contained in its own folder with the meters it's using. So for the first device, create a folder and then rename it. And I normally name it after the facility or the pad where the device is located. So in this case, pad 151. Right click, add a device, and then choose the device type from the list. In this case, it's a DNP3 FBX protocol. Right click and again, edit using the form. And then here we're going to complete this tab by tab. And on the first tab, we can change the name of the device to something more descriptive. FB151, as this is an FB3000 located on pad 151. The name you choose is up to you. Don't enable the device until we have completed the configuration. On the Options tab, you can pretty much leave everything as default unless you've got some unusual communications conditions. The same is true on the Details tab. This is where you enter metadata describing the physical location or the asset that this device belongs to. You can use these to filter later in AUTOSOL. On Logging, fill in those items that you do want to see in the logs. I'd recommend at the very least logging warnings, but as we're configuring the system, it's useful to see some other information, for example, when you make configuration changes. Next, you're going to specify the connection that we're going to use for this device, and we choose from the connections we created the ports. And as we only have one port, you can see it both in the tree on the left and in the selection dialog. So select it, click OK, and then the same for the schedule. Choose the one schedule we created, which is visible both in this dialog and on the left. Then go to the Device tab. Here, you will first of all have to enter the destination address. This is the DNP3 address for this RTU. You can see this in FBX Connect, but by default it's 1. The source address is actually the DNP3 address of the ACM server, but you can leave that at 0. That will always work. If it's an FB3000, use select operate for control rights. That's a requirement. The next tab is for time synchronization configuration. Here you would choose, for example, the time zone you want to synchronize the device to, but we won't bother for the purposes of this demo. On the Archive Collection tab, we specify the rate at which data is collected. Here we've just left everything at interval 15, which is that hourly rate. You must also specify use meter config from the device and use history points from the device. This tells ACM to automatically configure itself to determine where the tags from the RTU will go when the CFX file is created. It's also a good idea to log the progress of those uploads and the configuration so you can see how that works in the log file. Next is the archive settings, and here we want to collect events and collect alarms. You'll notice there's an option to select an event map. We're not going to do that at this point. We're going to rely on the automatic mapping, which will map around about 80 to 90% of all events to the correct meters. You also have the option to publish any unmapped alarms or events to all meters. By default, they'll go to what we call the generic meter. Here, we configure the generic meter by adding it to the system. We have no meters, so we select Add, choose where the meter is located on pad 151, and it creates a meter. We name meter. This is the generic meter for pad 151, so we choose an appropriate name. The generic meter is a meter that doesn't really exist, but it's used to capture any events or alarms that are not mapped to other meters. So it is recommended you add one to the system. And then you select it, and you can see that's been selected on the generic meter. If you then choose station 1, if you recall, station 1 was the first DP meter in our RTU, so we have to add another meter. It's going to be on the same pad, and here we specify the name of that meter. So we'll call it DP meter underscore 151. It's a differential pressure meter on pad 151. We won't change any of these settings at this point. We're just going to leave the system as default. But we do need to select the meter we've just created. Click OK, and you'll then see it in the station 1 settings. We want to collect hourly data for that meter. Note that we did not do that for the generic meter because it doesn't have any history. You'll see that the device is still disabled, so we go back to the General tab, click Enable, click Save. The device will change the name on the left, and it is now enabled. And the first thing you should do is confirm communications by choosing the command Test Communication, hit the Execute button, and you will see successful communication occurred. So close down the Device tab, and that completes the configuration of the device. Once you have confirmed communications to the RTU you've added, you need to add a publisher that can create the CFX files. These can be in a separate folder, so we're creating another folder here, and I'm going to call it Publishing. Then right click and add a publisher to this folder. Again, right click and edit using the form, and then click the Details tab to configure it. I'm changing the name to reflect the functionality, Publisher CFX, and enabling it. You then click the Publisher tab, and you need to choose an output type. And we don't have any configured at this point, so we'll add one. And here you can choose from the different formats that AUTOSOL supports. And we are just going to choose FLOWCAL CFX. Press OK, and then we can configure that. Its default name is FLOWCAL CFX1, which is OK. And here's the options for the data that will be in the CFX file and the format of that data. And then here is where it will be saved on disk. You'll see that it's being saved in C:, history data, CFX and a unique folder for each year and month. Press OK. Remember to check it's enabled and hit the Save tab. We can then close that and test it. To test it, go back to the device in the tree on the left. That's FB151 in this example. Right click, edit in the form. We can then go to the Commands tab, and we want to force it so that on the first collection it will retrieve the meter config from the device and retrieve the history header. This is so that the system can configure itself automatically using the information from the RTU. Having done that, we then click the Retrieve History button at the top, and this will force the collection of history. And if you look in the log window at the bottom, you can see the system is collecting history configuration and then history records going back in time. This can take quite a long time, depending on your communications link, minutes or even up to an hour if the device has not been communicated with before. So you need to wait until that configuration and the retrieval of the data has been completed. Once the retrieval of the configuration information, the history and the alarms from the RTU has been completed, the window will stop scrolling and you should see that the alarm collection has been completed. You'll also notice that there's an internal error, event buffer overflow, for this RTU. That's nothing to be concerned about at this point. That means that the RTU is generating DNP3 events and we have not yet collected them from the RTU. Once the data has been retrieved from the RTU, you can then test the publishing. Right-click on the RTU in the left-hand tree and choose Republish Device Records. You'll be asked for a start period. I'm just choosing the default here, and this should create the CFX files in the location on the hard drive that was specified when we configured the publisher. And if we look here, we can go to today's month and date, and there's the two files for the 2 meters, our generic meter and the DP meter. And then if we open them in the FLOWCAL CFX Show CFX utility, you can see the basic configuration of the meter, which will match what was in the RTU. And then if we go to events, we have a single event that was a change in plate size. There's no alarms for this meter, but you can see that all of the history, this is the same history information as we saw at the beginning of this video in FBX Connect, has been collected and successfully published. You'll also see that the file header is named ACM and then the RTU name. So thanks for watching. That concludes our demonstration of adding your first FB3000 to a fresh install of AUTOSOL ACM. We will have other videos in this series, including showing how to clone or copy that RTU to create others, and also how to do custom mapping of your events and alarms so that instead of being mapped into the generic meter, those alarms and events that are not automatically mapped can be mapped into the correct meter. Again, thanks for watching.